Hey everyone, we have a special surprise for you today, a conversation with Ted Chiang that we recorded a while ago and are releasing now as a special bonus coda to Season 1. I also have another conversation with Ted Chiang coming up, an event to promote the trade paperback release of The Unraveling, happening this Tuesday, July 26th, 6 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time at Skylight Books. There'll be a link in the show notes. So excited to have that conversation with Ted Chiang and excited for you to listen to this one. Enjoy. Welcome to Mohan Raj and Rosenbaum Are Humans. This is Ben Rosenbaum, alleged human. Marianne is out today, and I am interviewing the illustrious Ted Chiang, my old buddy. Hi, Ted.
Hey, Ben.
So thank you for coming on Mohan Raj and Rosenbaum Are Humans. I feel like we should have some standard guest question like, so how human do you consider yourself? In what? Tell us a little bit about being human.
I guess I'd have to know more about what was the basis for uh, your your podcast title and what metrics are you using?
I think that's precisely the question. What metrics should we be using?
I mean, I don't have anything to suggest right now, but I assumed that you must have had some in mind. I guess at least before you ask a question like that, you must have some metrics in mind.
The question literally just occurred to me. It is not our tradition to ask all our guests that, although I think if it were, then I would be most interested in figuring out what metrics they would then employ in answering the question. I think that would be the real purpose of the question. In any event, this podcast does tend to have a lot of strange sudden cul-de-sacs of that sort, as you can imagine, since you know me and Marianne. We've known each other a long time. When did we meet? What WisCon did we meet at?
I don't know. I think the first WisCon I ever attended was probably in 2001 or 2002.
That was probably before my time. I think I didn't get
Um,
there until some years after that.
so so early 2000s.
Yeah, WisCon is the world's leading feminist science fiction convention, I believe. For a while, it billed itself as the world's only in Madison, Wisconsin, and we know each other from there. And it's funny also because I just, as research for this, I did research. You should be honored. I went and listened to the podcast where Alice Sola Kim was interviewing you, and that was also we know each other from WisCon, right? So it's a thing. And I do actually feel like that's kind of that is my intuitive feeling about my writing community is it's there's a sort of a generation of people I feel like centered on WisCon that are the people I feel, you're among the people in science fiction that I feel closest to. And it's there's a whole group from that time and place. You know what I mean? Feel like it was formative.
I do. Although I have to just make a quick note of surprise that I didn't know that my interview with Alice was available. I guess I knew at the time that it was recorded, but I'd completely forgotten
Surprise!
That it was recorded because it was a live it was a live event. So as opposed to a podcast, but
it is an excellent interview, and if you search on Apple Podcasts under Ted Chiang, it comes up, among other things. But I was, of course, wanted to hear you talk to Alice.
So it's findable by searching on Apple Podcast. Interesting. But yeah, I mean, so also, I mean, Alice was a Clarion West grad, and you were a Clarion West grad.
Yes.
I don't know if
were you Clarion San Diego or?
Well, I was at the original Clarion when it was in Michigan.
Oh.
That was it because Clarion didn't move.
Is that the original? Well, the somewhat original. Was that the original? I thought the original was in Pennsylvania or something. Or is that anyway?
We'll say that the original was in Michigan. It was in Michigan for decades, and
yeah.
it didn't move to San Diego until like I think 2008 or something like that.
Right, right, right. Yes, it was in Michigan. I think Michigan was its academic home, and I am thinking of like Damon Knight's living room when I say Pennsylvania. That could be.
Yes, yes, I think so. But yeah, I attended the original Clarion in Michigan. But I was living in Seattle at the time that both you attended Clarion West and that Alice attended
Yeah.
Clarion West, and
Oh, so
so
maybe we even met there.
we might have. I mean, I don't recall specifically, but it's entirely possible that at one of the Clarion West parties that
Yeah.
we interacted.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you had Ellen Datlow as one of your instructors. Is that am I remembering
Mm-hmm.
that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, I did.
yeah.
Octavia Butler, Bradley Denton, Nalo Hopkinson, Connie Willis, Ellen Datlow, and Jack Womack.
I mean, so I did regularly attend the Clarion West parties, and so I think I probably met Alice at a party when she was a student there. I mean it's possible that you and I interacted at a party, but yeah, we don't really
Right.
remember that.
It's a similar pattern. It's also my pattern of my relationship with Marianne is like met originally at Clarion, solidified this friendship at Wisconsin. So it's a thing.
I mean, yeah, they are definitely sort of hubs of the science fiction community.
Yeah, and I think of our specific slice of the science fiction community because I think there are lots of people
Yes,
who come out of
yes,
Writers of the Future and Baen books and like there's a whole lot of corners, right? But it's a sort of
yes, yes.
it's our gang in some way, maybe.
Yeah, yeah,
I
I
think of
agree.
it as. So I am assuming that our podcast listeners know who you are because you are illustrious and celebrated. And I'm not sure you always like being illustrious and celebrated. Is it the case that you have a certain ambivalence about it? Or am I
Um,
projecting
well,
in a wannabe kind of way?
it's a little weird. It's a little weird to
Yeah.
think about. It has often been observed that a lot of people become writers because they are introverts. They
Uh-huh.
Most people don't become writers to become famous to attract attention to themselves. Um,
Right.
most people become
Although
writers.
some do, I think, but you are
Oh,
definitely in
yes,
the
yes. I mean,
camp of not.
some do. Of- Absolutely,
Yeah.
some do. But I think many, maybe most people who
Mm.
become writers are not trying to attract attention.
Hmm. Certainly not to their persons. I mean, maybe to their words, but yeah, there's a difference, arguably.
Yes,
Like, I mean,
yes,
there's a tension because it is a very introverted pursuit in some ways. I mean, I'm an extrovert, but like that is in some ways a barrier. It is by nature an introverted thing, but it's also, of course, like you could become a writer and never send anything out. Like you could, I mean, it's especially in this day and age when there aren't that many people, particularly of short story writers in this era, when there's not a lot of people banging on keyboards making a living at 3 cents a word. It's probably not the most lucrative profession. There must be some desire to be read or to have the words be read, but that is not necessarily the same thing as wishing a lot of attention personally.
yeah. In general, yeah, I think writers do want to be read, but yeah, as you say, that is different than wanting to sort of be the center of attention or have a lot of eyes on you. Yeah, I think most writers are not looking for the limelight. I
Hmm.
guess, and I think that is fair to say about me.
You're right. So I was thinking a lot. I've thought about this interview, and I was thinking about our conversational patterns. We famously love to argue. We single-handedly, or I guess double-handedly, got the word singularity banished from Karen Meisner's house. If you, as you may recall, or maybe Dave Knowles was involved as well, but it was
Yes,
banned.
I think I was a participant in that. I mean,
Yes.
I have some complicity in that, but I mean, I think David Moles was definitely also
Okay.
uh,
Yes, probably,
complicit
probably.
in that.
Yes, and probably the most likely to get banned by not shutting up about something. So I'm sure my complicity was, disproportionate. But in any event, so there is a kind of interview technique in which you ask open-end questions and have the interviewee fill them in. And I thought I would attempt that, but then I thought what would be more likely would be that I would end up just making assertions about you, which you would then refute as an interview technique. Does that sound like us?
I mean, uh, Christopher Rowe, he does this impression of you and I
Oh,
having
yes.
a
A
conversation
mime impression.
in the blog comments where,
Yes.
yeah, he mimes you like tapping, 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 and then
Furiously.
you know, and then he mimes me sort of sitting there thinking, and
Scratching your
then
chin.
and then briefly tapping a few lines, and then you reply again with another 1,000 words in your
Yes.
response,
Yes. I think
um,
that's, yeah.
which is
Yes.
something that
It's
which
more of a caricature of you than of me, I would say.
you mean less accurate, or when you say more
No,
of a
yeah,
character?
and because I mean, in blog comments, certainly in spoken speech, and he may be influenced by our spoken presentation, I probably talk about 3 times as fast as you and fill the entire air. If it was cartoon speech bubbles of us standing together at a con, it would be like all the things and then you say. But actually,
Yes,
to be fair, in blog comments, I think you often respond at length. Back in the days when there were blog comments and that was how things went down.
yes,
But
and I think it
anyway,
was often in the comments on David Moll's blog,
it was, in
actually,
fact. And
just
and
to
often I think the pattern
bring
is
him
that
in.
I make provocative and outrage. I think you and I find each other useful as grist because I would make provocative, outrageous assumptions then in the glory days of our youth, and then you would take them very seriously and respond to them in detail as like claims, which and then I would be forced to defend them, which I don't know, it's a very useful process for me. And you seem to keep doing it, so you must have enjoyed it as well.
I mean, at one point at a WisCon, I think you explained it this way, because to a casual observer, it might easily seem that you were disagreeing for the sake of disagreeing. You were trying
Ah,
to
yes, but I do not do
say,
that.
but yes, to many, many observers, it might look that way. But then you pointed out that that was not what
Yes,
you were doing. You saw this argument, the argument in general, as a kind of collaborative truth seeking, so that,
yes, yes.
and in service to that, you did not adhere to any position for longer than was absolutely necessary. You would
Right.
rapidly switch positions, and then argue something
Yes.
orthogonal or completely diametrically opposed to what you had previously argued, because you were constantly trying to just like piece together
Get at the
some
truth.
trying to find some useful direction in which to head. And
Yes.
uh, but yeah, to a casual observer, the fact that you would change position at a moment's notice made
Uh
it
huh.
seem like you were disagreeing
Uh
for the
huh.
sake of disagreeing. And it can be very frustrating for people who are sort of trying to argue a certain position, and the fact that you were constantly
Yeah.
switching
Yeah.
positions.
I feel like it was even worse about this before you met me. There were a couple of times when I specifically remember having. I mean, I think I went away to college in the habit of just arguing whatever came into my head, and I learned not to. Like I decided that it was not actually that it was beneath me to say things I didn't believe, and that I should always argue from a position that I really honestly could support. And so then I began to do that. And then sometime later, I would get in these arguments with my friend Ethan where he would be infuriated with me because I was precisely as you say, I was essentially not bothering to concede the point. right? He would assert something, I would find his assertion convincing, and therefore immediately come at it from some different direction. And he was very frustrated because he thought, I may not have, since you still remark upon this years later, I may not have learned it perfectly, but I attempted to learn to mark the transitions. You know what I mean? To say, I grant you that. Okay, so however, right? Like, I mean, and therefore, but that is a
Yeah.
but I think it is a culturally distinct style of arguing. I think of that. I don't know. I mean, I know my thing is very Jewish, right? Like, I know that the idea that the way you learn is to argue, like that's how you would figure anything out, is like 1,000-year-old cultural pattern that I come by honestly, right? Like, of course, the way you would figure something out would be to start adopting positions and arguing about it, and then that's how you would get anywhere. And I know that that's not necessarily how the rest of the world functions, but that is something I am conscious of as a way in which we all participate in this kind of double consciousness, where in some ways we are, or I mean, I do anyway, where in some ways I feel comfortably entrenched in the mainstream world, and then there are places where I'm like, oh, I am not like everyone else. And that is certainly a place that I'm conscious of, like, that I am uh, have a distinctive specificity about, like, you know what I mean, about my little group is not necessarily how the rest of the world functions.
But I
Do you
think,
have
yeah, I think
that?
you're better. You're better. You're better. I think you're making an effort.
Oh, I'm making an effort, and I mean, it's a kind of it is an effort of translation in a way. It is what I by learning to mark those transitions, I am learning to be more comprehensible to those who are not necessarily out of the box by default playing the same game that I am. You know what I mean? But it's not that I say things that I don't think are true. But I do think that you and I also, one of the things we love to argue about is epistemology. So I think that my relationship to truth is very different than yours in some ways. You know what I
Yes, I
mean?
think that's probably true.
So I've been thinking about themes in your work. I think artists' obsessions are interesting, right? Like, you're not necessarily aware of your own obsessions, but like there are things that are recurring motifs.
Sure, sure.
And I think those are some of the most interesting things. Like whatever is a rich vein that you keep digging at is a rich vein. And it's interesting when I looked through your stuff in preparation for this, thinking about recurring themes. And I think one of the reasons that when I wrote them down, I was like, wow, no wonder Ted and I get along so well, because I think there's a lot of overlap. It is fascinating how much you write about parenting. Like, a lot of your stories hinge on parenting. There's the nanny one, there's the life cycle of software objects, there's the truth of fact and the truth of feeling. Like, I mean, that's
That's true.
interesting.
That's true.
I know why I'm obsessed with parenting.
Can you say why you are obsessed with parenting?
I said I know why I am obsessed with parenting.
Well,
When I kind of I
can
am a
you say
parent.
why it is? Can you?
Yes. I think to some extent there's an overlap in the sense that part of what I find so interesting about parenting, but I think you may find it even more interesting, is like that it is. Some of your stories about parenting are about the fact that parenting is the relationship in which people become human. So you start out with a baby and it becomes a thinking person, and that is connected to some of your other obsessions, which is the nature of cognition and, like, determinism and free will are another two on the list. But anyway, I mean, I am also, of course, very, like, parenting has been a big part of my, like, being a parent has been a big part of my life. It's a big part of has been a big part of, like, the struggles and ups and downs in my life, and therefore I'm, like, very emotionally invested in it. Literary writers, everybody are always asked, is your stuff, like, how much of this is autobiographical? And fantasy and science fiction writers are always asked, where do you get your ideas? That's the parallel question. And so it's kind of funny when you read a zombie story and people are like, how much of this is autobiographical? And you're like, I don't know, I was never bitten by a zombie. And yet, certainly, I am very clear about, like, how much autobiography there is in my work, right? Like, you know, A Siege of Cranes is about, like, this dad trying to find his baby who's been stolen by, monsters. Now that didn't happen, but that of course is a central fear. Like I wrote that just after I had my first child, and I was like feeling hugely vulnerable about it. And I think it's in a way I feel like you resist autobiography or you remain opaque. Like there's a
Yeah,
way
I
in
think
which
that's
I
fair.
don't think you're I don't think
That's
you're
fair.
interested in advertising those connections, right?
Yes, I think that is accurate. I'm not interested in advertising those connections.
Are you just not interested in advertising them, or are you also not interested in them?
Well, I suppose to some extent, I don't know. I often say that I find my own life really kind of boring. It,
Uh-huh.
I think, yeah, the specifics of my own life just seem not worth writing about, or not sufficiently interesting to write about. Um,
Yeah. I
so
mean, I hear that about the specifics.
the things that I am interested about will inevitably be shaped by my own experiences. So in that sense,
Yeah.
my life will play into what I write. But yeah, I think it's going to be hard to to identify anything in my stories that seems like something that might have happened to me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the narrow version is the might have happened, like the literally might have happened, right? Like, I mean,
Mhm.
and I find that actually not only, I mean, I don't think my life is boring, but I don't think that it's necessarily what I want to write about literally. And also, I don't find it very productive. When I was writing a story in, I decided to write, I was asked to write one of those nature short stories in the back of Nature, and I decided I wanted to set it around here. Like I wanted a 50 years in the future, and I was like, okay, well, I live in Basel. Like, what will Europe be like in 50 years in the future? And I found that I couldn't put it in Basel. Like, I put it in Frankfurt. Frankfurt was the right distance away. Like, I've been to Frankfurt. I've walked around Frankfurt. I have a feeling of the city. It's not like setting something in Ulaanbaatar where I would completely be pulling stuff out of my ass, but it's like enough distance that I don't actually know. I don't know enough about Frankfurt for it to interfere. You know what I mean? I don't like in Basel. I'd be like, okay, well,
Okay,
which street specifically? Like my head would be full of all this specificity that wouldn't be helpful. Frankfurt is abstract enough that I have the taste of the city. I'm not gonna, I feel like it will feel roughly like Frankfurt, at least to the way Frankfurt feels like to a tourist. And if I look stuff up, I'll understand it. Like I'd be like, okay, what's the Frankfurt soccer team? Okay, I can stick that detail in. I kind of know what that would, maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but having hung around Basel and knowing about the Basel soccer team, I feel like I have some sense of what. Whereas if I'm writing about Mongolia, I have no idea how they feel about their. You know what I mean? So it was like the right distance away. Like too close
sure,
is wrong,
sure.
but some connection is right. And I find that's a lot of the stuff that's autobiographical is like, you know, I wasn't going to write about actually like I don't know what was I doing the first month of my daughter's life. She was not being stolen by monsters. I was walking around in circles singing her lullabies until she went to sleep. But like I did put the lullaby, I did put one of the lullabies in the story. But like clearly it had to be transposed. You know what I mean?
You're writing about your anxieties in a way that a genre writer might, or
Yes.
speculative fabulous might.
And also I want to point out that it's kind of only in retrospect that I mean I guess I was semi-conscious of it, but my intention in writing in sitting down to write the story, I was not like now I will write about my anxieties that about Aviva because I feel very vulnerable since she was just born and like could die. That was not I felt that way very strongly. But in fact, what I was thinking is, okay, I got this rejection from Blackgate for this other story, and they were like, "What if you made this long? Like, we were really a sword and sorcery magazine. You should make this longer and make it more sword and sorcery." And my first reaction was like, "I can't. I don't. That's not the kind of writer I am. I don't write sword and sorcery." And my second reaction was like, "Wait, why not? Like, I loved Moorcock. I loved playing RuneQuest campaigns. I can make like a picaresque episodic story in which just lots of cool shit happens and there are really weird looking monsters. I could do that. Like that was my motivation. Of course, actually, I ended up writing about like the grief and terror of being a parent.
But also, and it's kind of funny because that story was published in a volume edited by David Moles, who seems to be
That's
a
true.
recurring theme in this conversation.
Yes, he
But
recruited.
that that
We well, it's a
that
small circle of people
that
who leave. Yeah,
that anthology was called 20 Epics, and so your story was an example of sort of an attempt to create the feel of an epic in a
Hmm.
short story. So in that sense, you were sort of trying to, in a way, kind of work in a mode that was maybe atypical of you, using a mode that was typical for you.
Yeah, yeah, no, sure, right, and yeah, but that's, and I don't know if this is true of you too, but I feel like the impulse gets me started to write the story is not necessarily what the story ends up being about or being. You know what I mean? Like often my attention is not on, like when I talk about, when I mention autobiography and how you resist autobiography, I'm not saying, like, I also find it not very fruitful to be like, well, what was, oh, I will write about, I don't know, like a literal thing that happened to me literally. I mean, that's not the kind of writer I am. It's probably going to have, Talmudic zombies or be in space, like it, right? It's probably not going to just be, but I also don't even start with the thematic concerns of, like, I will write about the terror. I start often with ideas, world building, or language, but the thematic stuff sneaks in. And I am quite interested in, well, the reason I say, are you interested in the thing itself, not merely advertising it, is I am quite interested in then discovering it. I'm like, oh, that's what that was about. And I find that interesting. And I don't know if you do that and don't tell anybody, or if in a way you resist doing it, like you resist looking for the traces of the connections to your life.
I don't know. I mean, I recognize that there is this sort of theme of parenting that appears in a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of my work. So I freely acknowledge that. Am I going to try and, I guess, psychoanalyze myself and, relate that to my experiences as, you know, as someone who doesn't have kids, but,
Either as a child or.
yeah, but, but as someone who has parents, I'm going to say that, yeah, I guess I'm not inclined to try and connect that to my own personal
Yeah,
life.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so yeah, the resistance to autobiography goes all the way down.
Yeah, I would say that, I guess I would say that my interest in parenting is more abstract, and it more has more to do with like some of the things you mentioned, like this: how do you make a person? You know, what does it
Mm-hmm.
mean to
Yeah,
make a person?
yeah, that's
You
what the
know,
life cycle of software objects is about,
yes, because
in particular.
that has a lot to do with what with questions of what is a person? What does it mean to be a person? And so that is a question that I think is very interesting, and I guess I think that the question of the the topic of parenting maybe is unjustly ignored in a lot of discussions about
Mm-hmm.
uh, personhood,
Yeah.
and I don't know if that you know how much of that has to do with the sort of devaluation of you know domestic labor or women's labor. I'm sure I'm sure it has something to do
Oh,
with
also,
those.
I forgot story of your. Wait a minute. By the way, on the list, story of your life is obviously
Yes,
hugely about parenting. Yes,
yes,
please go
yes,
on. I'm just like, how did
yeah.
I leave that off the list? Go on.
But yeah. So uh,
Can I just say, by the way, that was beautifully done in the movie because I love that story. And I'd read, well, probably shouldn't spoil anything. I love that story and I've read it a lot of times. And when I saw the movie, they still fooled me. I won't be too specific, but like basically, like there was an enormous emotional impact in the fact that even if you read the story, I saw it and I was like, oh, I guess they changed this part. That's kind of dumb. And then later it was like, oh crap, you know what I mean? Like that. Anyway, go on.
I mean, well, yeah, I think they did do a really good job with the movie, and I can't take any credit for that. But yeah, I think the movie does a really good job of translating the story
Hmm.
into a form that works for a general audience.
Yeah, into a Hollywood movie. I mean, it's a Hollywood movie
Yeah,
with chase scenes, which is so funny because of all the stories. Like I was when I heard that story was being adapted, I was like, really? That, like if you had asked me like name a story that would be impossible to adapt into a blockbuster Hollywood movie. Like, there are others of your story I would have, I could see Understand. That's basically a superhero story, right? On some level, it's like a duel between mind magicians. Like, that's, so I was like, really? That's a story that's like intensely interested in physics and linguistics, and there, and like all, and it has this complicated time loop. And anyway, but yeah, I mean, not time loop exactly, but deterministic shift, like understanding of time. Anyway, that's another of your obsessions, by the way. So
Anyway,
determinism and free will. You,
yes,
you were gonna. I think I interrupted you twice now. What was the thing you were gonna say about? You acknowledge that parenting is a theme.
yeah. So I think yeah, parenting is a central question in any discussion of you know personhood, what it means to be a person,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and it is sort of, I think, maybe underappreciated. I think that we like to think of questions of personhood in a very sort of abstract and kind of purely theoretical
Mm-hmm.
context. A kind of, I guess, maybe in some ways, maybe a sort of a Cartesian dualistic sense of, think about it, mind is completely separate from body. And,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but yeah, minds don't exist without bodies. Minds
And also as
come
a
in.
mind separate from time, right? Like, that's sort of the argument. One of the arguments that life cycle software objects is making is minds are also not these sort of, like, there's a sort of fiction in the Enlightenment version of the world in which children don't really count, and then all of a sudden, at some point, you achieve the age of intellectual, like, competence, and then you're just this being, and it's like timeless. You're sort of like, this is you, and then perhaps you're snuffed out. You come into being, and then you go out of being, but like, you're just. Whereas instead of it being a historically contingent, iterative, developmental, embodied process.
Yes, and yeah, that embodiment is, I think, inextricable from that sort of developmental aspect of
Yeah.
personhood. And um, and so specifically in the context of life cycle of software objects, I think especially when people talk about artificial intelligence, when they talk about a thinking machine, about a mind that exists in something that we build, yeah, they, in that context, everyone wants to think about it as, yeah, this yeah, some sort of idealized thing which is completely separate from embodiment,
Mm-hmm.
and appears fully formed and has no sort of developmental history. And
It
yeah, and
snaps into
like,
being as an adult, and
yes,
it's a
and
Star
yeah,
Trek
and
voiceover version of.
I mean, uh, it's Athena springing from the head of Zeus, fully formed, and uh,
Right, right.
and yeah, and you know that's not how that's not how people work.
Mm-hmm.
We have we have no reason to think that is how people can work.
For
That
anything that
anything
is
that
a
we,
person.
yes, that anything that we recognize as being sufficiently person like, that we would want
Mm-hmm.
to give it any sort of rights and responsibilities. You know those arise from all these embodied and developmental histories.
I mean, I would make a stronger claim than that. Not, I mean, not only, yes, anything we would want to give right or responsibilities as a person, but honestly, anything complicated. Like, that's not even how the Google search engine works. Like, even something we don't remotely consider a person is still the product of some historical chain of development and growth, and has, clunky limitations built into it, and is the product of how it has encountered the world in some ways. Like anything beyond, like, there are of course things that are purely designed, but the minute, honestly, the minute you even go from, like, I mean, probably this is, I don't know if it's true of a bridge, but it's certainly true that, you and I both come out of software day job wise, and are sort of part of a generation of science fiction writers. I think Cory Doctorow made this point to me at one point, who, like, for whom, like, the previous generation of science fiction writers, computers were just magic, Like William Gibson had never seen a personal computer when he wrote Neuromancer. Like it was just kind of like they were just like plot devices. The way that people in our
Yes,
generation use nanotech. If you want something to happen, you just say, well, it's nanotech. You know what I mean? Like I don't know, how did he live forever underwater without being able to breathe? Well, it was nanotech. You know what I mean? We just hand wave him. But that's not how we see computers. We think about there being bugs and there being. I feel like Werner Vinge was the first person, is the beginning of that wave. I love the bit in A Deepness in a Sky where you find out that deep in the code of some incomprehensibly, future thing, they're like programmer archaeologists, and they figure out that like it's still using Unix date epoch as a date, and they think that's because it commemorates like when humans first walked on the moon, because it's like January 1st, 1970. So they're like, this must be that they chose a
right.
date, like this is this many seconds since people first walked on the moon. Anyway, but that fact that even though that's not like super intelligent AI software, that's just software. But the fact that it has like the fingerprints of people from generations ago, you're never going to get rid of that code. You know what I mean? And that something about how we relate to software is that it's like messy and real, and has it is a kind of it's not embodiment in flesh bodies, but it is not just being an abstraction. It's having a history and a contingency that is, some mistake that somebody made in the code, which is never going away and other people have built workarounds for, is how software actually looks, and is not how like the godlike Athena intelligences of, it's not like an Asimovian AI. It's not messy in that way.
Well, that's interesting. So certainly, when Asimov was writing, computers were very remote and abstract.
Mm-hmm.
Asimov, when he was writing his robot stories, I'm sure he'd never been in a room with the computer because
Probably
hardly
not. Yeah.
anyone, you know,
Yeah. Well, yeah. Good question. I mean, if he had, it would have been on a tour of, in the
yeah,
Navy or something. I don't know. But yeah.
yes, yeah, and so like Asimov's depiction of robots, and a lot of writers of that era, sort of uh,
Hmm.
people working in say the 50s, their depictions of computers, they were very very abstract.
And it's precisely what you say, that it's Platonic dualism. Their image of a computer is like a Descartesian mind without a body.
Yes, for the most part, yes. I guess so. I'm wondering, when does that?
I mean, I feel it's true up through cyberpunk.
Well, so I guess I feel like there may be some maybe some different factors at work which we could tease apart. One is like actual
Hmm.
experience using computers, you know, seeing computers as being part of your daily life, and
Hmm.
getting a sense for computers' impact on you know people's daily lives, which I think William Gibson, I think he grasped something really important about that, even though he wrote Neuromancer on a manual typewriter.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. But he was certainly living in a world where he was certainly living in a different world than Asimov, in the sense that
yes,
the way that computers were affecting how a bank operated or how an aircraft operated, or all that. I mean, he's surrounded by computers, even if he didn't have
he
one.
yes he could see
There
it,
were even
but
stand-up video game consoles.
yes, but that is entirely separate than the the thing that you refer the example in Vinge's Deepness in
Hmm.
the Sky, which has an awareness of how software is developed. It has an awareness of you know what a legacy code base looks like.
Yeah.
Uh, that that's sort of a separate thing because like just as one sort of maybe trivial observation, that the thing that that Vinci points out, that the awareness that Werner Vinci has of how code how legacy code bases persist, that is cool,
Hmm.
but that is something that
Hmm.
is probably maybe only meaningful to a relatively small number of readers. um
I don't know. I mean, it's only meaningful in the sense that, sure, I appreciate it in terms of the shock of recognition of, like, I found it hilarious. That specific joke was for me, sure.
yes.
But in another sense, in terms of the point you were talking about, understanding what a computer is, in the sense that you aren't seeing it as this intelligent mind sprung from nowhere, that you're seeing it as made of stuff. Like, I think that, I don't know. Like, I mean, in that case, it wasn't necessarily an intelligent mind.
I mean, so yeah, I guess then the question is all right. I got one way to phrase it is an awareness of a legacy code base, is that the same thing as the thing that we were talking about how the embodied and developmental history that you know that are part of making a person? I guess I'm not.
I don't think it's the same thing.
Yeah.
I agree, it's not the same thing. I mean, after all, Werner Vinci is also guilty of the singularity, right? So it's not like he took that and ended up where we ended up. You and I are both like, we part of the reason we got banned for Karen Meisner's house for arguing about the singularity is we both find it such a fruitfully infuriating idea, right?
Yeah. Yes. I think
And I think
that's a
life
good way to
cycle
put
of
it.
software objects and life cycle of software objects is an anti-singularity story, in a way that, I also feel like I have certain things that are like, that come out of that impulse of, like, there's a lot of, like, it's a fruitful vein for me to spend a lot of time trying to explain to the Vinci of the original singularity paper, why he's wrong. Yeah, and the ineluctable embodiment. Right. So I'm not saying that's where Vinci ended up. But I'm just saying that there's a way in which I feel like the Asimov Heinlein era, which was full of people who were actual physical scientists, and sort of like started doing orbital mechanics, and, like, you know what I mean, started like what we think of as classically, like, and it's a weird term, but sort of hard science fiction. It's a very odd. There's a whole twisted genderedness to the term hard science fiction, but like the fact that Gernsbackian, you know, or maybe even like Wellesian science fiction was just like, and then we get in the rocket and it takes us anywhere. And then, like, you went to an era where people were like doing the calculations. You could feel the calculations in, like, they sometimes were showing off in a way that I don't have the same aha moment because I'm not a physicist, but, like, you could tell that they're like, that somebody's doing some clever thing that's analogous to the Vincian thing of, like, the joke about epoch. So I guess it's partly a thing of where you have a bunch of practitioners who are, at some point there will be real nanotechnologists writing science fiction. And then there will be nanotechnology that doesn't feel like it does in Diamond Age and now, where it's just Handwavium. It actually feels like the gritty, realistic, like, limitedness of nanotechnology. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I understand your point. Although, that also, sort of could lead into a discussion of, will there ever be real nanotechnology? Um, you know,
Here's the thing: the goalposts move. Is there real? Like, will there ever be real AI? I mean, well, now there is, because machine translation is AI. Like, Google Translate is clearly Google Translate meets the bar that would have been meant by AI. No, there won't ever be nanotechnology in the sense that I have a Handwavium box that can make anything. But, like, yeah, like, there are already things on the market that are like raincoats, where the lining is like made by literally, like, arranging atoms. Like,
yeah,
it makes a raincoat. You know what I mean? It's like, no, it doesn't
yeah,
make like a magic device cornucopia.
yeah. That's not what people mean by nanotechnology. Water repellent fabrics
Well,
are
no, but
not
it
what
is. But see, that's
not what people mean.
but who are people? Because that is what some VCs mean by nanotechnology. That is what some no, right? That is what some annual reports mean by nanotechnology. And there will be the same way there is with AI. There used to be just one thing called AI. It was magic computers that someday we would click a button and they could play chess and try to conquer the world and translate human languages and become your friend and lover. And it was all in the same box, right? Now we found out that, like, recognizing handwriting, translating, and playing chess are actually in one box, and, like, trying to take over the world and being your friend and lover, different box. And that's going to happen with nanotechnology, where now we are like, arranging individual atoms to 3D print medicines, and a cornucopia that can, like gray goo taking over a planet. Those are in the same box. They don't actually go in the same box. Like, they will be 3D printing. You will walk into a doctor's office in 20 years and they will take a blood sample and 3D print a custom vaccine for whatever variant you just got. That's going to happen. but like, is it an infinite cornucopia of like, that will usher in an age of post scarcity? No. Different box.
So I guess I think Drexler. I think Drexler himself switched. He proposed switching to the phrase molecular nanotechnology to distinguish what he meant by nanotech and what other people were using the word to mean. Because you know
Okay.
Drexler himself, he doesn't want to call
Mm-hmm.
these new water repellent fabrics nanotech. That's not what he's interested in. That was not
Okay.
what he was talking about at all
Sure.
in his book, Engines of
Okay.
Creation. So he
Okay.
so he has had to come up with a new term to be more specific about what he meant,
Mm-hmm.
and so in that sense, like I think it's still an open question as to whether that is whether that will ever be a thing. So in that sense,
Well, what is the thing that you're not, what is specifically the thing? What is the thing that may not ever be a thing? Like, does 3D printing vaccines count as the thing that may, I mean, is that,
um,
which is the thing that the open question is about?
well, I think Drexler is talking about sort of kind of I think what he calls mechanosynthesis,
Mm-hmm.
molecular machines, and you know we don't have anything like that right now. We don't. I don't think we have anything remotely close to that. So that is so when you say that, oh, like one day there'll be actual nanotechnologists writing science fiction and they'll write about it in a much more realistic way. Like actually, I don't know. I don't know if they're actually going to be working molecular nanotechnologists, people who like their day job is in programming a universal assembler, and then they're going to be able to write science fiction that has a real grittiness and
I
verisimilitude
mean,
in its treatment of universal assemblers. I don't know that that's actually going to happen.
when okay, but that's fine. But when you say universal assembler, like that's, I don't know. I also don't know if there's such a thing as universal assembler. I don't know. I don't know. What I'm saying is, we have a bunch of things in the same box that are sort of about the micro manipulation of individual atoms and stuff. I think there's probably a
I mean,
spectrum
I
between
mean,
you taking a very small dot and sticking the atoms together versus the atoms sticking each other together versus, already like CRISPR is already like, I mean, is CRISPR not a molecular machine on some level? Sure, it only works because you have this enormous apparatus of like a living thing already, and you're just tweaking it a little.
I'll bet Eric Drexler doesn't think it is.
Okay, well, maybe not, but I mean, what I'm saying is, it seems to me that there's a spectrum between what Eric Drexler thinks can be. I mean, Alan Turing was talking about a machine that would pass the Turing test, which we kind of, I guess, maybe have. But certainly, if we'd been having this conversation, I
No,
don't know, like,
no, no, we don't. We don't.
no, but here's the thing. We don't have a machine that is anything like something we would recognize as a person. Not anything like, not even, I mean, not even a thing that we would recognize as a cockroach. Like, I would not grant any of the machines that we have made the degree of personhood that I would grant a cockroach, right? You and I are completely with each other on that.
I'm with
What
you.
I am saying is that
Yes,
what
absolutely.
I am saying is that the metric of the Turing test is not, do I in considerate, the metric is literally the when Turing talks about the Turing test, he introduces the example by giving the example in which you would in which he starts by saying, imagine a game in which you try to fool someone about your gender. Like, you are typing to them on a typing machine, and the inquisitor is trying to find out if you are a man or a woman by talking to you, and you are trying to deceive them about your gender. It's very interesting and revealing that that is how the paper on the Turing test begins. But anyway, he's talking about deception. He's not talking about personhood. He's talking about a machine that can trick you.
No, he's not.
That's the
No,
metric.
he's not.
That's the metric. It's the metric he
I
proposes. I'm not
no, it
saying
is.
that's his goal.
No, it is
I'm not saying that's
that
what he
that
believes.
no, no. I think we're in disagreement here. Turing is not talking about a lying machine. He
Hmm. Okay. I mean, I think Turing thinks that a machine that could pass the Turing test would be. I think he's proposing it as a way of getting at what would be a person. So I grant you that. I don't think Turing thinks he's talking about a lying machine, but he's pretty specific about what the test entails.
Um,
I guess what I'm saying is I think humans turn out to be a lot easier to fool than Turing imagined, and therefore the Turing test is not a good mechanism for doing what he thought it would do.
so I see. I don't think that what my reading of his paper is
Mm-hmm.
that he is not actually interested in a lying machine. He's not interested in a machine that fools people. My reading is that he is not envisioning a machine which actually lies about anything. He is envisioning a machine whose basically truthful responses would eventually reveal that it has no body, that it has never been outside, that it has never eaten food. Uh,
Maybe we're referring to a different paper.
no, no, no.
Like, are we talking about the same paper?
Yes, yes, we are. Because if he were talking about building a lying machine, he would talk about things like, okay, so we'd have to give it a plausible backstory. That's not, and that he never talks about that. What he talks about, like he gives examples which are basically, sort of, pure reasoning types of things. Like, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? It's like, what do you think? What if we change that to, a winter's day? It's like no one wants to be compared to a winter's day. So he's talking about a machine that can actually have a discussion about the meaning of poetry. And so when he says that after a certain period of time a person would be able to guess that it was a machine, what would give the machine away
Uh
is
huh.
not the fact that it's like, not the fact that it says like, I don't understand, can you repeat the question?
Let me just really,
He
because here's what the
what
paper
he
actually. I
what
have the
he
paper before me.
what he's going to get, what he says is going to give, what he thinks is going to give the machine away is it'll say things which eventually you will realize, like, actually, you've never played in the snow, have you? Because
Now,
in the in
suppose X is actually A, then A must. Let me just read you one sentence. One sentence. It is A's object in the game to try and cause C to make the wrong identification. That is in the first paragraph, the third paragraph of the paper. It is A's object in the game to try and cause C to make the wrong identification.
you're focusing on the wrong thing. I'd say skip past the first few paragraphs. Go down to where he says, he talks about it, like later in the paper he says things like strawberries and cream. You know, the do a search. Can you do a search on that?
I found the winner's day, but sure, strawberries and cream. Uh-huh. Be kind, resourceful, numerous features, X or Celeste. I grant you that you can make machines do all the things I mentioned, but you'll never make one to do X. I mean, he's no longer talking about the test. At this point, he's not talking about the imitation game. He's talking about the more broader question. He introduces a test as a way of saying, if someone could pass a test, should we consider it a person? And then he goes on to say, people object that a computer could not possibly do X and Y, but I would argue that the things a computer can do make it more like we could construct a computer which is in principle. He certainly spends much of the paper arguing that true personhood is possible in a computer and that we should acknowledge he is definitely on the side of his future computer descendants who he wants us to be able to stretch our minds to imagine as being our brothers and sisters and that they have true interiority and personhood and are real. Yes, I'm not saying he thinks it's all a trick. I'm saying that the game he proposes, the imitation game, is about deception. I did not start this by saying we have achieved computers which Turing would acknowledge as his progeny, his intelligent progeny. No, I don't think that's true. I think if you went back in time and explained the situation now to Turing, he would say, "Well, those aren't intelligent." Sure, we are at one on this point. Nor do I think we will achieve any such thing in the next 50 years. But I think that he would be
No, see
forced to
what
acknowledge that
what
his metric in the imitation game is not like that is the when people talk about the Turing test, they are talking about the imitation game.
See, no, I don't see. I think that that is a misreading because I think that
Okay.
you know he actually talks about like you wouldn't be able to send a thinking machine to school because the other school kids would tease it. So
Yes.
so he's thinking about a machine which has no body, has maybe has may or may not have eyes, but it thinks in all sorts of it's all sorts of ways that we recognize as thinking, and that is the machine that he's trying to convince you that it actually thinks through this test because that
Yes.
machine that machine will eventually fail his test because eventually through
Yes.
conversation you will realize that you've never actually
It is
eaten
a
any
machine.
food, have you? Yo, so that is a machine which actually thinks, but
Sure.
by virtue of the fact that you were able to
Yeah.
have a meaningful conversation with it for a certain period of time before its physical limitations became apparent, that means you have to admit it actually thinks. Before you became aware of its physical limitations, you
Hmm.
know, you thought you were talking to a person. Before you realized, how much it wasn't
Yeah.
a person,
Right.
you thought it was a person. So
So what you're saying is, allow me to. Okay. Here's what I think you're saying. What you're saying is that the important moment is not the moment when you were fooled into thinking you were talking to a person. That's not the important moment in the Turing test. The important moment is when it fails the test and you realize it's not a physical person, and you are nonetheless compelled to acknowledge its personhood, reflecting back upon the conversation that you have had. If that is the definition of the Turing test, then yes, the machines of today do not pass the Turing test because when you point out that if it is revealed to someone that it is a bot, they will go, oh, well, then that is not a person, it is a bot. So yes, if that's your, I I
yes,
I think that's
yes,
fair.
that is what I think he is getting at, and I think that what he is getting at is I think the point of the having using a teletype machine, having this conversation over a teletype machine, that is an attempt to overcome people's immediate prejudice that because if you saw who you were you know uh, having a conversation with, he assumes that you would immediately say, like, "Oh well, of course it's not thinking." You know, it
No,
obviously
I
can't.
understand that.
Yeah.
I understand that. I understand that. I think what I'm interested in is a different question. I will concede the point that it is a better formulation of Turing test not to focus on the moment of you being misled to think it's a computer, but of the moment where you have to acknowledge it's personhood despite realizing that it is a computer. I think that is the point of the test. But what I think Turing was not confronted with, because I don't think that is something that would have occurred to anyone in that era, is a computer. It's almost like it's almost like there's four boxes, right? There's something that the box you're talking about is if you didn't do the teletype game and you were brought into a room with a bunch of wheels and reels of magnetic tape and punch tape and flickering lights, and you were asked to believe it was a person, you would even though it truly has personhood because it is in fact a thinking being, you would be misled by prejudice into thinking it wasn't. You would reject it out of prejudice, right? That's a case that he considered. And
Yes.
then there's the case
Yes.
where that has been
Yes.
elided, that prejudice has been elided. You were able to grasp its true nature, and therefore you recognize it as, so you correctly recognize it as a person. But I think the case he was not presented with is something that is effectively very good at fooling people into thinking it's a person, to the extent that it has reshaped our political landscape, arguably, in the age of the Twitter bot, but which is clearly not a person once you understand its true nature. It's the opposite. It's something which your prejudice leads you to believe that in fact it is your friend and a person. And actually, only if you had access to the true nature, you would realize it was not. That is a different case, right? The imitation
That
game has
yeah,
been
that is a different
weaponized
case.
in 2021.
That is true, but that is not what Turing was talking about. So
No, it
You know,
isn't. It
the
isn't what
case
Turing was talking about, but I
the,
think
the
it's a case.
case that the cases that Turing was trying to distinguish are the ones like, you know, like, I can see it's a box, so I'm going to
I get
disregard
it.
it no matter what it says. And then it's like, okay, you can't see that it's a box. Now, can you,
I have
you know,
grasped its true personhood.
yeah. So that is what he is interested in.
I am completely acknowledged that that is what he's interested in. What I'm saying is because this is related to that conversation we were having about in that era where people thought a computer was just something that would spring out of Athena's, Athena sprung from Zeus's brow, right? It's like I think someone from that era would say, well, if it could carry on a conversation with you, then of course it would be a person. You ought by all rights to acknowledge its personhood. Only prejudice might stand in your way because clearly, look, it's talking like a person. Like, why should you not acknowledge that as a person? And what I'm saying is that no, Turing did not have the information necessary to consider the case in which there is a diabolically clever machine which fools lots of people and isn't a person. That is interesting that we live in that world. And I think part of what I'm getting at is we are not as clever as we think. Like we are easier to manipulate than we imagine in the sort of dualist Platonist world in which I'm this mind driving this body. I'm also like full of reason, and unless I'm sort of my thinking is disordered for some reason, like all things are intelligible to me. Or it's similar to like Homo economicus. It's like of course I will make rational deals with all because all information will be. And in fact, it's like no, I'm this sort of mess of neurotransmitters and hormones, and I most of the time I'm reacting and my consciousness is making a story up afterwards. Like I'm much more mechanistic and messy than we thought. And also, like, the box of like playing super intelligences to deserve our compassion was very large. And it is as remote as it was in 1945. The computer person Turing is talking about is as remote to us today as it was in then. Like, we are no closer. I mean, in some ways we're closer in the sense that we have like an infrastructure where you could imagine, but like we have still not seen that thing. But there is a bestiary of things we
Yeah,
have
we
seen.
are, yeah, we're perhaps infinitesimally closer. You know,
We are perhaps infinitesimally
yeah,
closer, and we've
uh,
created this bestiary of things that have enormous impact, that do things that we would have previously considered. We imagined that our artificial child sprung from the brow of Zeus was going to be the one to translate poetry and to talk about us deep into the night about our fears and hopes. But no, it's its diabolical cousin who has no personhood, and it's all smoke and mirrors. That's the one who's talking to us about our hopes and fears on Twitter, and that's the one who's translating our poetry. And it turns out you can do that without being very clever, because guess what? Humans aren't that clever. Like being able to get someone to fall in love with you, being able to translate poetry, not that hard. Not requiring of intelligence. You could do that with statistics and a fast enough chip. That's the interesting thing
yes,
that we've
yeah,
learned since
yes.
Turing, is what I'm saying.
Um,
All right, anyway.
uh,
Do you have more to say on this topic, or shall we get back to something remotely resembling an interview?
I mean, you know, I'm fine with continuing to talk about this topic, but I guess yeah, I
Yes.
just want to
Mm-hmm.
reiterate that yeah, most of this has nothing to do with Turing. You know, this has nothing to do with what Turing was interested in, and so when people say like, oh, you know, the Turing test is bad because we have things which pass the Turing test, and they're stupid, and the Turing test is actually a very poor metric. It's really easy to pass. Like I think all those statements are based on a fundamental misapprehension of what Turing was interested in. So you know, it is worth discussing the fact that that chatbots are kind of are that simple chatbots are surprisingly effective. That is worth talking about. That says nothing about what what Turing was interested in. That and it says nothing about the legitimacy or validity of the Turing test.
I have a quibble. And my quibble is that it certainly is true that it says nothing about what Turing is interested in, but it also is. I wonder if you're being. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'll have to read the paper again. I wonder if you are being saying the Turing test is bad seems like a very vague statement. Saying, for very good reason, people in 1953 imagined that some things we now know are easy would be hard, and that therefore conversation would be a metric indicative of intelligence. And it turns out not to be the case because of things we've learned about what conversation is and what computers can do. And therefore, no fault to Turing, he was living in 1953. But conversation is overrated as a mechanism of determining sentience on some level. Like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I know what you mean. Turing is talking about. I think I like the formulation that Turing is talking about the moment after you realize that it's a computer. When you then go, oh, it's never tasted strawberries, but given everything that I know, I must acknowledge its sentience. And sure, I agree, that's a good metric. In fact, it's the only possible metric. There isn't any other possible metric for, you know what I mean? That's like Damon Knight's definition of science fiction, that it's what I point to when I say is science fiction. Saying that what we acknowledge, what we ultimately should acknowledge is it's almost tautological to say that we will ultimately acknowledge as sentient is something that after all due reflection and having all the information we are forced to acknowledge as sentient is sure, yes, that's true. So in that sense, the Turing test is inevitably valid if it's tautological.
Well, I mean,
But like the specific mechanism of teletypes in an imitation game has limitations.
it's not at all tautological because you know there are many people, certainly in Turing's time and even now, who will refuse to grant a machine personhood no matter what it says, because it's a machine, because they can see that it's made out of metal.
Yeah, I'm not
You
saying
know,
that everything, I'm not saying everything's in Turing's paper is a tautology. What I'm saying, so there's Turing's paper and then there's the test. So here we have two candidates for what the test is. The test is either the imitation game, in which a computer convinces you for a while that it's a computer, or your improved version, it's the moment after the imitation game, in which you are persuaded that it is human. All I'm saying is tautological is if you're not persuaded that it's human, then you're not persuaded that it's human. And if you are, it's after you get all the information. So if you're the sort of person who's going to categorically deny that a being of silicon could ever be human, then the moment after you get that information, the whole thing, sandcastle is going to fall apart and you're like, it was lying to me all the time, it's a machine, then you will not acknowledge it. Turing is making then a series of beautiful and compelling rhetorical arguments to sway your heart that you should acknowledge it, which is great, and he should, and I'm all for it. But that's not there's no metric there. There's no, the metric is, have I persuaded you that you are wrong to not acknowledge the possibility that it's human? The metric can't be, can it converse, right? History has shown that can it converse with us is not a good metric. The metric of like, do you at the end of the day feel in your heart that it's human, which I think you correctly argue is the real metric that Turing is arguing for, sure, but that isn't, right? That's not a quantifiable metric other than on a tautological level, that if you acknowledge it's human, you're acknowledging that it's human.
I guess I might want to move away from the term metric because that assumes. I mean, that implies that that there's a measure, that there's a score that you can assign, which
Uh-huh.
I don't know
Is that not
because it's
implied
sort of
by
a
the word test?
well, I don't know. I don't know. Does a pass-fail test have a metric if there's no score?
Well, I'm fine
Um,
with using the word test.
okay, but
It's interesting if you, here's something that just occurred to me. Here's an interesting reading of the paper. Maybe I'm wrong to think that he means the Turing test in the sense that the emphasis is on on us evaluating a consuming personhood. Perhaps we should read it, the Turing test, as the Turing ordeal. Perhaps we should see it as the passion of the computer in the Christian sense. That the test is actually that the computer is enduring the trial of trying to convince us of its personhood.
it's like a Stations of the Cross kind of thing.
Exactly. I mean, I'm willing to. That's an attractive reading. This is an example of me like being perfectly willing to abandon the field and come at it from a completely different direction, as you called out earlier.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's the harrowing, but
The harrowing.
so
Yes.
so I think I think what Turing is, I think what Turing is arguing is he's sort of, I guess, making an appeal to kind of intellectual honesty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's also making an appeal for his values.
He's not saying that this will convince people who have deep rooted prejudices, but he's saying that if you are intellectually honest, you will have to rethink things.
I think that that's what he intends to say. I certainly agree with you that that is his intention. And I think that I find the argument persuasive. But I am enough of a relativist that I do not think someone is intellectually dishonest in the slightest if they are like, the essence of being human is warm flesh in the sunlight and being able to enjoy strawberries, and I will never accept this machine as being human, not because I am denying what I truly know to be true, but because when you stack up, like, you know, a hungry soul full of curiosity and love against like the physical experience of a body, I just think the second one's more important. That's not intellectually dishonest. I don't like it. I don't want to hang out with that person necessarily. Although I'm not even sure that's true. I'm not even sure that's true because I mean, I'm sure there are people who I like who are more on that side of the camp. You know what I mean? Like I'm not even sure. I'm not even sure it's to frame that as a prejudice is a
I don't think Turing is actually. I don't think Turing is arguing about sort of who is more valuable, but
uh-huh.
he's talking about thinking. There could be a separate discussion like machines think, but they still have no they still have no rights. They
Mm-hmm.
still have no personhood. You know that would be a separate question. But can they think?
Sure. Sure. No, you're right. You're right. The
He's like,
question is, can they
yes,
think?
yes, and he's like, if you're intellectually honest, then you will have to admit that they can think. You may not. You don't have to like them. You don't have to
Sure.
respect them. You don't have to give them
No,
rights.
I agree. Okay. So so to some extent I agree with you that the main point of the paper is a solved question for me and you and probably for everybody. Like he was in fact in 1953 addressing a kind of prejudice which I'm sure some people still have, but I don't think I don't think it can both be intellectually honest and well informed in this era. I think he's addressing a kind of prejudice that it is simply impossible for a machine to think because that's not the sort of thing a machine can do. I think he's saying that for an arbitrary definition of machine, not necessarily some machine we can build today, but like a Turing machine, like an abstraction of computation, like that there is some set of behaviors which we would be forced to acknowledge as there's some sort of behaviors that is computational. It is computationally possible to do a thing which we would be forced to acknowledge as thinking. Like, yeah, sure, I'm sold. But of course, that is the question he poses. To be fair, when he's talking about his heart clearly goes out to the little computer child who he doesn't want to send to school to get teased. That is not that like clearly he's talking about other things. Like clearly there's more at stake than the simple question. I mean, I think that's what he thinks is at stake, and I think that is the point he was originally fighting against his primary opponents. I am not very interested in fighting because it seems like a no-brainer. It seems like a no-brainer that it is conceivable. I don't understand what could possibly be special about a human brain that nothing, no matter how abstractly imagined, could not do a thing, right? Like, if thinking is a thing that I can do with this lump of meat, I don't understand how it could be the case that some other configuration of matter could not do that thing. So I'm totally on board with Turing's main point. But I'm just saying that the way he constructs it.
You and I are in agreement, but I don't think everyone is in agreement. Not everyone
Well, no.
shares
So,
this
okay,
opinion.
maybe I shouldn't dismiss that it still has some validity. This paper simply for sure. If you're listening to this podcast and you cannot imagine that a thing that is not specifically a human brain could do something that you acknowledge as thinking, you should read Turing's paper because in that case, it's still a pretty good argument. It holds up for why perhaps you should reconsider that belief. However, what I'm more saying is I'm struck by how different Turing's world that he was living in is and what we found out about humans and computation. And so, as I said before, I think it's fascinating that we're living in a post-Turing world in which, like, it's a real and important political fact that machines are good at fooling people into thinking they're people, and yet we are very, very, very far from imagining that, after all due consideration, we acknowledge these machines as sentient. Like, that is interesting. That is interesting because, and it's partly along the lines of, like, easy things are hard, hard things are easy in AI, right? Like, in some ways it's like, turns out playing chess was not that hard. Stacking blocks, harder. And that's not what people thought in the 1950s when they began the quest for AI. They were like, clearly, the things we valorize that men who have gone to Harvard can do are the hard things. And the things that mere women and servants can do and children are the easy things. No, that's wrong. The thing that you valorize is this tiny little, very
Yes, yes,
specialized part of the world, which in fact is, like, just
yes,
perfectly set up for computers to do it, since computers come out of that same intellectual tradition that what was hard for you is to train your human brain into doing these abstract puzzles, but the abstract puzzles are pretty easy for a computer, and doing all the other stuff that humans do is really hard. Anyway.
I mean, yes, and again, I think you and I are in agreement on that. But I mean, there are still a lot of people who are super impressed by, say, AlphaGo and AlphaZero, and the fact that there are these programs which are now
I mean, they're impressive.
play
But you
superhuman.
mean impressed in the sense of,
There are some people who think that these are super significant in terms of
mm-hmm,
sort of the relative states of human intelligence and machine intelligence. And you know, um,
mm-hmm,
I don't think that the ability to beat the world's best Go player is a major milestone in sort of achieving machine intelligence. But a lot of people seem to think that it is.
yeah, I mean, yes, and that does dovetail with another thing, which is there sort of are two different things going on when you talk about intelligence, and this is another thing that has been sort of revealed to us of how different that they are. We imagine the world in our image, and sort of we imagine that as things get more intelligent, they'll get more like us. And so there's actually two different projects. One is, I mean, there's sort of two different things that you could mean by intelligence, and they will become more and more radically different as time goes on. One of which is just like us, can talk to us, can hang out with us. We acknowledge that it can think because we understand its thinking and it's persuasive to us as a thinker since it's a thinker like us. Like, the kind of thing that Turing is talking about in the paper is partly like usness. Like, oh, you are a kindred spirit even though you are housed in metal. Like, Turing is arguing against this prejudice, which is sort of like, this spirit in this machine is a spirit like me. It is a spiritual brother, even though it is made of metal and copper wire and vacuum tubes, and I of flesh and blood. We are one, right? That's the like usness part. But, like, in some way, like, we are not the summit of the chain of being. We're just like one weird thing that happened. You know what I mean? We're just like an interesting fluke constellation that got on this, like, sure, we stumbled onto this, like, positive feedback loop exponential thing where, like, we have culture and then this makes us make stuff and then we get more culture and then we get more of us, we live longer, we have culture, and we transform the world very quickly. We're like a really crazy kind of organism. But, like, it's just one of the many, many, many branches of, like, the tree of possibilities. And when we, in some ways, you know, AIs of the kind we have now, by which I mean, like, I don't know, some database that with statistics is deciding who will go to jail, and, corporations, another artificial life form that we've created, are like, they're not smart like us. They're not even necessarily smart in the Turing's can machines think sense, but they certainly are, like, they are heading in a direction. I mean, we're already at a point where you have to acknowledge that we become acclimated to machines doing feats that would be startling and terrifying to, 10-year-old me, and would seem like some kind of disturbing and sinister form of intelligence described to 10-year-old me. And, like, we just sort of increasingly accept them as a matter of course, and they're not like us. They're not heading in the direction of quote unquote Turing-y, can machines think, kindred spirit in a metal frame, human intelligence. No, but they're heading in a direction where we are one part of an ecosystem which is composed of many fearsome beasts that are as incomprehensible to us as we are to them. Like, if intelligence has to do with adapting to configurations of the world and producing dynamic behaviors that influence those configurations of the world, then we may very quickly get to intelligence in that sense, which we would not remotely acknowledge as having personhood, but which is way better at altering the configuration of the world in a quick, dynamic way than we are. It doesn't have to have any desire to taste strawberries or discuss them.
Hello, humans. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast, this is a friendly reminder for you to like, follow, and subscribe on whatever platform you use to tune in. It helps us grow as a show and reach a wider audience. You don't want to miss Season 2 coming soon in fall 2022, so make sure you're subscribed. Thank you.
Well, okay. So, I suppose this gets to, or I suppose one way to ask this question is, do corporations have goals that are completely distinct from any humans involved in those corporations?
No, not completely distinct, but arguably significantly distinct from that of any human. Not completely distinct, but yeah, they definitely have definitely. They definitely have goals that are meaningfully distinct from that of any humans. Yes. I mean,
See,
having worked at
I
plenty of corporations and other large organizations where, like, no one wants to do this thing, but there's enough of an interlocking chain of people who will get in trouble if it doesn't get done that it's just less of a hassle to go do it. Even though literally every person, if you ask them, would be like, fuck, I don't think we should do this. That happens all the time. Like, of course, a human is deciding, but the human is deciding in a very constrained way. Sure, there's always a human who could pull the plug, and there's always a human who is thinking it's the least worst option at the moment. But there can be a complex enough structure that each human is presenting to the other human a set of least worst options, which, none of them would actually choose. It's going to head to a Nash equilibrium.
guess I think a lot of corporations, they do things which, while they are inconsistent with the values of many of the employees, they are largely consistent with the desires of, like, the CEO, the board. Yeah, I guess we'll say the board.
I mean, I am not going to argue that like boards of corporations are not plutocrats, or that they're not, or that they're somehow like enslaved to the horrible creations that they've created. Like, I'm plenty willing to assign them all of the culpability for the actions of their corporations, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is that it also would be an illusion to imagine that the corporation is simply an expression of the wills of the individual human members of its board. Like, I worked on software in the 2000s. Like, let's just put it this way. A lot of times those boards are acting out of fear. They're not acting out of, like, this corporation is a tool with which I can use to achieve my desires. They're acting out of, like, they don't really understand something, and they're doing the thing that somebody told them. They can't have enough information to understand it, and they're doing the things that someone will told them will make the bad thing not happen. That is a lot of what boards in fact do. There was a whole bunch of applications written in the late 2000s that by banks where they didn't really want to have to ship those applications. They were afraid that e-banking was coming. They knew they weren't up to it, and so they were making a bunch of stuff that, but they told themselves that they wanted to ship it. There wasn't like the boards were like, well, we'll just do this as a no. But they were basically afraid, and they knew it would fail. It's like the legacy code. It's like the Vinci legacy code moment. It's like people who don't actually make computers think that, like, they're perfect. Originally in the 50s, imagined them as perfect engines of computation. Turns out they're a rat's nest inside. It's like that with running a corporation. A lot of the times, these big corporations, first of all, it's like Game of Thrones, where it's all these fiefdoms and people are like, the board is not united. And second of all, it's like they don't have all the information. And I think there's meaningful ways in which the corporation itself is constraining what's even. It's also, of course, educating and self-selecting those people. People who do, and it's also the case that if somebody like takes a valiant stand and tries to like stop things that make no sense, they don't last very long. They burn out. They leave the board. They get someone who's more compliant with the goals of the corporation. Like the people on the board are pretty exchangeable too. It almost feels, again, they are culpable and willing, like, tax the hell out of them and break up their corporations and take away their power. Like, yes, I'm all for that. But one of the answers to the things that I'm saying is you really shouldn't let corporations get very big. You should definitely break up Google and Facebook, because the bigger they are, the less likely they are to be understandable by any human. And there certainly are corporations that are more of a cult of personality, where one founder or somebody or one group of highly motivated individuals is more, appears at least in public to be more calling the shots, and sometimes they are. And I'm not saying there are no edge case exceptions. And corporations that are in their early days, like if you're thinking about Tesla or Facebook, where it's like, yes, we have this charismatic founder who like has a plan and is calling all the shots. Initially, like, not Facebook anymore, but like initially maybe there's an era. But if you're talking about the Swiss banks, they don't know you know what I mean? Like they know enough to know what the hell they're doing, that they can sit on a pile of money and make more money forever. But they certainly don't understand or are in control of many of the things that they are in fact doing. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, yes, but I guess I don't think my argument requires that they be, complete masters of their, of their own fates.
Uh-huh.
It just means that or what I'm arguing is that a lot of the behaviors of corporations can be they can either be attributed to the actions of their board members, the decisions made by their board members, and they may not be happy, they may not be well informed, but they are making decisions that that guide the corporations.
I mean, in some sense, that's meaningless, though, because it's like, I mean, sure, I don't think them making decisions is the relevant criterion. I think if what you're arguing is that they have enough agency to be culpable and bear responsibility, that's certainly true. If what you're arguing is that the very fact that, of course, that's how a corporation is entirely composed of the decisions of all the individual actors. The board makes decisions, and then the CEO makes decisions, and then the managers pass down the things. And yeah, that's what it's made of. It's made of decisions. So like, that isn't ipso facto like proof that the point is that those decisions are constrained and that they're self-reinforcing. Like, once you go down a road, you can't get back out of that road, and that there's an imperative. Everybody, when they go to work, sublimates themselves to some deal that they've made with something larger than themselves, and has to do the stuff that that deal requires, and they no longer operating as the kind of full personhood that they were if they hadn't made that deal. And that's actually true at the top too. You know what I mean? Like, they are.
Sure.
If what we're saying is, are those people making decisions, then sure. You brought this up to object to my introducing corporations as an example of a thing which is sort of like beyond us and out of our control, out of the control of any human. I think there's a spectrum. I think it would be absurd to say that, like, it's just all, oh, the poor board members are slaves to the monstrous AI corporation. No, I'm not saying that. But on the other hand, the idea that the corporation is just a vehicle that its owners drive around and does whatever they want is also, I think, a misreading of the situation. It's more like an ecosystem in which the corporation, I think, if what we're looking at is what's predictive, if what we're looking at is what is a parsimonious explanation of behavior, right? Here's an experiment you could do. You could take two corporations and swap their executives. Two corporations that do totally different things. One does mining. You could take Ben and Jerry's and British Oil, and you
Exxon.
could take the two boards, Exxon, and you could take the two boards and switch them. You could put everybody on the Ben and Jerry's board on the Exxon board. And you could say, you've signed this poison pill deal. You're going to lose all your money unless you switch. We've got you this nice new job and this plush new office. You go work over here. You go work over here. You'll lose all your money if you don't do this because you were tricked into this contract. So now you have to. So go do it. And then they go do it. Some of them burn out and leave and are replaced by other people, and there's a shakeup and whatever. But essentially, the question is, afterwards, does Exxon now act like the argument that the people involved are the determining factor would have you think that then afterwards, maybe after a certain transition period, Exxon would now look like Ben and Jerry's, and Ben and Jerry's would look like Exxon. I think what you would find is much more that the people who were used to work at Ben and Jerry's and now work at Exxon are not riding bicycles and eating granola as much. They've got fancy suits and they're flying to their fancy meetings in their fancy suits. And after the fancy meeting with the fancy suit, they might as well go to the spa in the 5-star hotel in Davos. And that the executives who got moved from Ben and Jerry, Exxon, after a little complaining, and begin to enjoy the Vermont winters and strolling around with the cows and the bicycles. Like, I think you will where you sit is where you stand, is what they say in government. Like, to some extent, the institutions condition the people at least as much as the other way around. There's lots of mechanisms that make Exxon have an independent existence. There's lots of ways that people get punished if you put them into Exxon and they don't act like the part of the organism. They lose status, they lose their money, they are shamed. There are lots of ways of manipulating humans that are very effective that help make Exxon executives act like Exxon executives. You get rid of all those people and put in new people. It's a little like the whole, like, are all cops bastards? If you take a person who's totally not cop-like, and you put them through cop training and give them a badge and a gun and surround them by people who are like, you got to beat up that guy, he gave you lip, otherwise none of us are going to trust you and you're going to be fucked, they will start acting like the institution demands, or they will leave. And therefore, by a relatively quick selection process, the institution will have a homogeneous, independent existence in terms of a parsimonious explanation of the behavior of its actors. And if it wasn't good at enforcing the behavior of the humans in it, it would fail and be replaced by a different corporation. And there are umpteen management courses and things about how to get the corporation to successfully fulfill its objectives, which are largely about constraining the people. Like, I'm a huge fan of agile software development, but it's largely about standing in a room and applying social pressure that you do exactly the thing on the card. The corporation wants you to move this card from this column to this column. We've decided that that's the corporate. We had meetings and we determined that those are the corporation executives. And now we're all watching you to make sure that you do nothing but what the corporation wants you to do. I'm sure that's about control of workers, but there are mechanisms for making sure that the elites don't go rogue either, because otherwise the corporation wouldn't succeed at doing the thing that it does as an organism. Anyway, I've talked enough. That was my rant.
Well, okay, so then do you think there's anything that can, say, for example, change Exxon's behavior?
Sure, there are things. Yes, there's a variety of things. I mean, one thing that's super effective of, institutions are in an ecosystem and they respond to the pressures of the ecosystem. Something that the two top things that are super effective at changing organizations' behavior are unions, another organism of the same variety and size that can fight them on their own turf, and governments. Like, actions by governments and organizing people into unions have a great history of changing corporations' behavior, right? Because those are at the same scale and they apply pressures. And all of a sudden, it becomes smart for the, you know what I mean? If, like, there are selection pressures that in the they don't survive without being able to adapt. So if you change their environment, they have to adapt. And I'm not saying that actors inside the organization, obviously, they are always making micro decisions, Like, it's not like nobody has any agency inside the corporation, but they don't have unconstrained agency. And even though the organization are making up people making decisions, and they could make different decisions, it's still the case that the organization and its culture and institutions are a pretty good predictive mechanism for parsimoniously explaining their behavior, partly because humans are easy to manipulate.
Well, because, I mean, it sounded like you were making an argument that no matter who you put in the Exxon board, Exxon would basically be unchanged.
No, I wouldn't say, I wouldn't say it that absolutely. Well, that wasn't my thought experiment. My thought experiment wasn't that you put in, Gandhi and, it wasn't that you search the world for the absolute best, like, environment changes. My argument was just that you switch literally those two boards. You take whoever's on the board of Ben and Jerry. That was my thought experiment. Take whoever's on the board of Ben and Jerry's, put them on the board of Exxon. I'm not saying you couldn't assemble a crack team of transformation Avengers who would turn Exxon into, some kind of solar energy commune. You could, and in fact, such things have been sure, but I'm just saying even then, there would be unintended consequences and surprising results of what would happen, and there would be a wild ride. And secondly, the circumstances would have to be right. And I don't know, there's all kinds of transformations of institutions, like things. It's a very dynamic field. It's like countries. It's easy, we have more information about countries, so it's easier to say, why did South Africa go from being a racist oligarchy, a racist pseudo democracy, to being a like democracy? Or why did the Soviet Union fall? Well, sure, there's a lot of individual actors. There's also like social pressures and global events and things that you could make a bunch of different arguments about how that. It's like the great man theory of history, and how. I mean, could you have done it without Mandela? Probably not. Could Mandela have done it without the macroeconomic and other situation? Probably not. Like you know what I mean? They're probably necessary but not sufficient conditions. Let's talk about something else.
Okay.
Unless you have
Okay.
more to say about that topic, then maybe we go to a
Okay.
rapid fire round.
Okay. Okay. Sure.
I mean, rapid fire by within reason. But I want to ask you this:
Okay.
why is the life cycle of software objects written in present tense?
It's written in present tense because I wanted the aftermath of that story to be open. Because I guess I felt like if it were written in past tense, that would suggest that all these events had already happened, and then that would imply that we sort of had some idea of where things went after the end of the story. And for me, I guess part of the point of the story is that we have no idea what's going to happen once that story ends. We have no idea where it's going. Because again, sort of like raising a child, you have no idea, how this is going to turn out.
Yeah.
You cannot predict it at all. And so, I mean, and like, not just, because like raising a child, like, we have ample precedent of people raising children. So even though we can't predict, what will happen with any particular child, we have ample precedent of what happens,
right.
like, from, in the,
in general.
Yes, yeah. But like in this story, like,
yes,
this is a type of child no one has ever raised before. This is
yeah.
These this is something which has never been attempted before, and so there's no precedent. So the future is completely open.
You do this in a wonderful way, where in the last bit of the story, Anna allows herself to indulge in imagining a future, and then calls herself on it. You know what I mean? She allows herself a moment of imagining that they grow up and become independent as corporations and do this and that, and then she sort of snaps out of it and goes back to the immediacy of childcare. And which emphasizes what you're saying, that it's unknowable. I think one of the things that this ties back to, I'm going to say one more thing about that, and then I'm going to ask you another question. But one of the things that ties back to our discussion, both about the Vingian, so like how does the Vingian messy code insight connect to the anti-Vingian argument about the what experience is algorithmically incompressible, is one thing the story says. The ineluctability of the embodiedness. And one thing that and this also ties into our discussion we just had, in which I went on a long rant about corporations as entities. You've constructed bodies, vulnerable bodies, for these children, which gives the story a pathos and a specificity of pathos that most stories, there's a long tradition of, like, going back to the 20s at least, of like, well, and Frankenstein, of like stories, science fictional stories, in which we create artificial beings that we then we have a moral relationship to as their creators, often as lovers, weirdly, but sometimes also as children. And this story has a specificity to its pathos that these creatures, even though they're software and they're replicable, but the fact that this so much of the story gets concerned with like migrating them from one platform to another, and with the corporateness, like their bodies, literally their personhood is being incorporated as a corporation, their option for personhood, and the vulnerability of their bodies is a corporation going to pay for this software port. So you've created them bodies that are made out of that Vingian moment of like, oh God, this code's a mess. Like without that insight of how clunky actual software development is, you couldn't have the plot that these creatures exist in sort of cyberspace, except they don't, because it's getting decommissioned and it's going to get like they can't join the platform anymore, and you could run them on this decaying laptop, but like that's no fun. They don't have any real life unless you could port them to the other platform. So they have vulnerable bodies made out of corporate software is the best thing. Also, the name Jerk Vector is a
Yeah.
great name for a game.
So, that was, again, one of the things that definitely comes out of, the fact that we all have experience with software now in a way that like Asimov did not. We all have some familiarity with, rapid obsolescence,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes planned obsolescence, in a way that it was not in anyone's minds when people were writing about software, in the 50s about artificial intelligence. If you just think about, like, how long have your children been alive, and do you own any piece of computer hardware, from when they were born? You know, is there is
Right.
there is there any software that you still run?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's this huge disconnect between the time scale of conscious beings and you know and modern software. And yeah, it's not even, and like, even forget about people. Like, if you have a cat, you're a cat
Yeah. Yeah.
has lived long enough.
Lives way
Like,
longer than.
yeah, like
Sure.
no one is still using a smartphone that is as old as their cat. So there,
Unless they just got a cat.
yeah, yeah. I mean, no one's going to keep a phone as long as they keep a cat. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it is almost, yeah, it's almost literally impossible to keep a phone for as long as your average cat will live. So yeah, so there is this sharp disconnect, this sharp incompatibility,
Mm-hmm.
which I guess we'd often like to think that, yeah, once you're made of software, you can live forever. Yeah, and this also,
Right. Well, that's what I was going to say. That's part of this story's trenchant anti-singularitarian, anti-extropian, why it's such an effective takedown is because that's exactly, it's also the story is being written in an era a few years back where that was all the rage, and where this longing for like, we'll upload ourselves and live forever was such a, and it's like, are you kidding me? Like that's your idea of stability is software?
yeah, it is.
Good luck
It
with your
is. It
migration
is.
cycles.
Yeah, it's one of the least stable, substrates that you can imagine.
Yes.
Uh,
Right,
I
right.
mean, like, in theory, you could lengthen it, but yeah, like, we have all this huge economic pressure to shorten the time between generation.
And in a way, and the fantasy is based on like it's sort of like, oh, if we can just figure out how to map the human brain, and then we'll have this thing that runs in software, and then like, yay, it lives forever. And what you've done behind the curtain now is replaced our entire economic system since you know 1600 at least with something that would produce that. You know what I mean? Like you've imagined a way, like you've hand wave away how stuff is actually made and dropped in sort of a fully formed reimagining in which we build like ancient Egyptians. You know what I mean? Like essentially it's like now Ramses is in charge of global capitalism. That's how you've solved this behind the curtain, right?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, in some ways, I hadn't thought of it before, but it's sort of like the Long Now Foundation, and you
Uh-huh.
know they're building that Millennium Clock, some device which you know
Yeah.
will
Yeah.
will run for millennia.
Right.
And yeah, but yeah, it's an interesting question. How do you design for timescales of the same order as all of human civilization? And
Right. Right. Right.
you know,
And that is not in general. The 20 people who work at that nonprofit accepted. That is not how we're doing stuff on this planet right now.
absolutely, absolutely, and yeah, and software is pretty much at the very opposite end of the
Of
spectrum.
that, of the long now
Yeah,
clock. All right, I'm moving on because this is our rapid fire round. I want to point out a couple of things. One, did you notice that you have a great move, but you do it a lot, in which whenever you write maybe not whenever, but in general, when you write a story set in a divergent reality, in a secondary world creation, a world that works along different rules than ours, there is a moment where they postulate our world. I do this too. But did you know that? Like 72 letters, omphalos, and exhalation all have a moment where they go, if however, I were living in a world in which, and then they insert our world. I do that in biographical notes too. I just wanted to point it out. It's a cool move. Are you aware of doing it?
um, I guess I wasn't. I guess I wasn't.
I mean, it's a classic device, but it feels very Changian. Also, it's not like it doesn't fit. It's integrated beautifully, but it's sort of like you've created this secondary world for this moment, where at a remove they can imagine what it would be like to live in our world. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not as clear of the moment where it happens in exhalation, but it's a big deal in both omphalos and 72 letters.
It's kind of you to call it Changian, but perhaps it could equally validly be called Rosenbaumian there.
Well, yes, I'm guilty as charged. I do. I mean, I could certainly biographical notes. I do that. Where else do I do it? Do I do that a lot?
I don't know.
I may.
I'll have to think.
I mean, it certainly predates both of us by a long. I mean, it certainly
Yes,
is a
yes,
classic move. But
yes,
I
yes.
didn't mean to say Changi in the sense that I thought you originated it. I just mean that it's of a piece. It's integrated with your. It feels right.
I guess it's one of those things that's maybe implicit in alternate history stories. I guess I'm writing what might be called alternate cosmology stories. So
Yes,
you know
that's a
there
great name
is
for it.
there
Huh.
is a
To be fair, I don't know if they do it in the Tower of Babel.
I mean, yes, that's true. But
But anyway, yes, alternate cosmology is a great name for it.
but alternate history stories. I think there is often that may not always be explicit, but there is some sort of acknowledgement of the possibility of a different history, one which looks like ours, and likewise in or by analogy in an alternate cosmology story there is
Yeah,
some acknowledgement.
I mean that certainly is. Man in the High Castle. That's that'd be
Absolutely.
an example of that trope. Yeah, I feel like an alternate history, in what you might call hard alternate history stories, using that weird terminology again, like ones in which they're playing the game, like a cozy mystery, where they're like, you know what I mean? Where like those are the alternate histories where the rule is just like the rule is that the detective is in a cozy mystery or in a sort of locked room mystery or one of those cerebral mysteries. You're not allowed to have the detective figure out the murder based on a clue that the reader has not seen. You have to play fair by showing the clues to the reader at the same time that you show them to the detective. That's like the parlor game rules of that kind of mystery. Similarly, there are alternate history. There's some kind of rule that like the reader has to be able to figure out the point of divergence. You know what I mean? In the sort of classic cerebral alternate history where it's like, if only Alexander had not died on the. So there's often like a little call out where you're like, oh, that's the point of divergence. And that provides the reader the intellectual pleasure of being able to see everything as having if not for want of a nail, like that moment is the moment, and then you can see how the rest of the world extrapolated from it. I mean, not all alternate histories are playing that game, but that's like the sort of a classic form.
I think David Hartwell has claimed, or I mean, David Hartwell did claim that that was the point of alternate history stories. That
Sure,
to
much as a fan of
indicate
Agatha Christie might claim that.
yes. I mean, yeah, I'm not trying to defend this position. But yeah, I think that some have explicitly claimed that, you know, that is sort of the raison d'etre of alternate history stories.
Yes, I think that's very much like if an Agatha Christie fan claims that the point of a mystery story, but to which Patricia Highsmith and Dashiell Hammett and so on are definitely not doing that. Like they're doing a different thing,
Yes.
and you can be a purist and not call it mystery anymore. And you can say The Thin Man and Farewell My Lovely are not mysteries because they're not playing that game, but whatever. Like okay, fine. You could. In fact, I made up another word. Shadow. I called them shadow histories when I made fun of the whole on my meta story on this topic. But I think there are plenty of alternate histories that want to play alternate history without doing that specific, parlor alternate history like thing, or maybe sometimes they're doing it implicitly. But in any event, I usually can. I'm not. I'm always happy to concede terminology. So if somebody wants to call that alternate history and the other thing another thing, and they tell me what the other thing is, that's fine. But the thing I wanted to say is that there's specifically the trope that you do is not just that the reader knows, but that the character speculate. The character imagines. It's that's what I'm pointing to when I'm interested in. Is not just the reader saying, "Oh, if only," but that the character is speculating in tandem. You're speculating about them, and they're speculating about you. Yeah, that is also, of course, a me thing. So the recurring obsession themes, I was going to say, so parenting, cognition, which we've talked a bunch about. There are a bunch of stories that are about like what is cognition and what is thinking, sort of very much on the Turing paper we were talking about. I mean, also like understand liking what you see divided by zero, evolution of human science are about that. There are a bunch of stories about determinism and free will, which is something you and I like to argue about a lot, but
Yes.
perhaps we'll spare the podcast this time, since much of it might be rehashing. I feel like we probably already arrived at an equilibrium. But the Merchants of the Alchemist Gate, What's Expected of Us, Story of Your Life, and what's the other one that I'm missing? Because there's one it's the one with the boxes where they go in the End of Exhalation, where they go in and
Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom.
that's the other one. Yes. So all those are about that. I think maybe that's the only one that's not a closed time like loop because it's many worlds, right? Anyway, the others are all about like living in a deterministic world. And another theme that is like recurrent is religion. This is also funny to me because again, like you're not a parent and not a religious person. And I am both of those things. And we both write about these topics. So it's kind of interesting. And Omphalos, Omphalos, Tower of Babylon, Hell is the Absence of God. A lot of times what you're doing in those stories is there's like an urge to take religion, and it's a specific kind of religion. It's really American Protestantism, as a take it serious, or I mean, and probably more like the fundamentalist version of American Protestantism, and take it seriously as an intellectual system and ask it to play by its own rules. Okay, to be fair, 72 Letters, which is Judaism, not so those three are American evangelical Protestantism, and then 72 Letters is sort of something kind of Jewish. But anyway, to like have it play by its own rules and like to impose a kind of to take it by its own at its own word and impose a rigorous logic on it. To have a religion that works like science is at the heart of a lot of those stories. Do you know why that is an itch that you keep scratching? I think is my question.
Well, okay. First, I'll just say that Omphalos is not. I don't think of it as being about sort of American Protestantism, because young Earth creationism, while it was sort of got a big boost by a branch of American Protestantism, it young Earth creationism has been around a long, long time. It was the norm,
I
for
am
a
not
long, long
just.
time.
I mean, I don't want to diverge too much from your actual answer to my actual question, but I am not just sure. You decided to write a story. Again, this is about intention versus all the excess that is around the intention. Yes, you decided to write a story about young Earth creationism, and that was your intention. But what I'm saying is that it clearly the milieu is that, I mean, this is a hobby horse of mine, so I don't want to get into too long of a rant. I'll be short. There is a lot of cultural specificity to religions. You know what I mean? Like the way, and theological specificity, and the way that character specifically is thinking about her world and her relationship to the divine is of a very specific, you know what I mean? Like you couldn't just swap out Buddhism, it wouldn't work. You couldn't even really swap out Judaism. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I'm not saying there isn't young Earth creationism. Sure, but if you could write a story about some Hasidim who think the world is 6,000 years old, religion would function differently in that story, is what I'm saying. Anyway, so but to get back to the actual answer to the actual question.
Okay, so like, why is it that I keep doing this?
Mm-hmm.
For Omphalos and we'll say Tower of Babylon, I guess I think of those as and I guess also to some extent 72 letters. Those are to me. I was thinking about cosmologies that were held at one point. Often, sometime in the past, people made observations. They constructed a theory about how the universe worked. Those theories were eventually disproven as we made more observations. But there was a time when based on their set of observations, that explanation seemed plausible, and so I guess I guess I'm just really drawn to the idea of like, well, okay, what if subsequent observations had borne out their initial hypotheses instead of disproved them?
Sure.
So that is something that I guess I just find interesting. I think it's a kind of world building of sort of working out the consequences of a certain premise. Hell is the absence of God. That one I would sort of put in a different category.
Uh-huh.
That one is not only is that one more specifically about a kind of modern Protestant or variant of religion, but it is also the only one which does not take place in a purely mechanistic universe. For the most part, in Tower of Babylon, there's no active intervention by God. In 72 letters, there's no active intervention by God. Even in Omphalos, there's no active intervention by God. Hell is the absence of God. That story is all about active intervention by God.
Mm-hmm.
So that story is in some ways about I guess in some ways it's about what does the universe look like when the scientific worldview really does not work, when it cannot work, when trying to think about the universe as a giant mechanism fails radically. So while that story is about the sort of specific modern American variant of Christianity, that I guess that general idea of like what is it like to live in a world which it is, and a world which is sort of aggressively anti-mechanistic, a world which is constantly reminding you that you cannot make predictions. You cannot form sort of hypotheses about the universe as a mechanism. If you were living in a world which is governed by something that is an entity that is a person, and all the things that come with it, where that persons are unpredictable. Persons they they don't always follow the rules. And that is one of the things that that is one of the things that distinguishes persons from mechanisms, is that you have to treat them entirely differently. If you treat people like mechanisms, yeah, it will probably not go well for you.
Huh. Sure. Interesting. I mean, that's interesting because, of course, on some level, you are talking about scale because clearly, given our critique, the critique of Platonic dualism we were just talking about, you in fact believe that persons are mechanisms, just very complicated ones.
Well, yes, but
But not morally.
well, yeah, I guess in general, like a mechanistic view of the universe, you're treating the universe as objects, as consisting of the laws of the universe are objects rather than subjects, and then a religious view of the universe, the universe is made up of subjects, maybe just one subject.
I mean, it's interesting that I'm thinking as you're talking that the border of between persons and mechanisms is like a really rich theme. That's obviously what life cycle of software objects is about, and also understand goes the other direction. Understand is about taking a person and reducing them to the horror. It's a horror story in which the person has revealed to them that they are in fact a mechanism. You know what I mean? Like that's the horror in understand. They get
I guess
unraveled
I
by
had
the fact that they are.
yeah. I hadn't really thought of it as a horror story, and
Well, I called it a superhero story earlier in the conversation, but I think it's also
yeah,
the end is a horror story.
maybe the end is a horror story, but I guess, but it's also, I mean, in some ways, a wonder tale because
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, 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 yeah.
because there is also the wondrousness of
Yes,
understanding the mechanism that might
yes,
make up a person.
right. Which is a good point. So yeah, it's both. Yeah, it's not only it's both a horror and a wonder. The marvel of like, but it's an interesting point. But it's almost like if the distinction between person as mechanism is crucial, and if we must treat each other as persons, and yet intellectual honesty compels us to acknowledge that we are also mechanisms, then there's a then there that it feels like that story reaches the reason it turns into it's like that story has there's a deep attraction to understanding the laws of the world and being able to have to harness them to predict the world. That is your work is full of an adoration of the beauty of the predictive hypotheses, and then of course the gaze turns on oneself and one is sort of obsessively considering the extent to which one is also a mechanism, but that's like there's both ingredients, like wonder and horror are both in that revelation. At the end of understand, the guy is unraveled. It is revealed to him that he is being observed the way that a person would observe a mechanism, being able to predict it and control it. And that, the story ends in one of the most lyrical moments, I feel like, at which the literary technique is almost like descending into poetry because there is a dissolution of meaning. You know what I mean? Like he dissolves at the moment
Yes,
at
he
which
does.
his mechanismness is revealed. Mechanicity?
Mechanicity.
Mechanicity. Um, Hell is the absence of God. Tell me, feel free to rebuff my incursions toward, if you feel like this is an incursion toward autobiography, which you resist. But like, it feels like an angrier story. Hell is the absence of God feels like it is animated by anger. I mean, you say, because you present this, and I'm not saying that wasn't your intention, but you present it as like, well, it's an interesting thought experiment. What if but like you could imagine a world in which you could imagine it would be possible to imagine, or perhaps for someone else at least, it would be possible to imagine a nice world in which the universe did not admit of mechanistic predictability. One could imagine, right? But
Yeah, sure.
but this is a horror story, and it feels like it's an angry story.
So So I would not say it arises from any personal anger because,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, I'm not religious. I've never been religious, and so I guess I don't have the beef with religion that I think some ex-religious people do. Some
Mm-hmm.
people
Sure.
who were raised with religion and then you know gave it up. I think you know
Yeah.
yeah I think they have emotions about religion which I don't. I think that for me the I guess one of the interesting things about religion is and or specifically about monotheism. One of the interesting
Mm-hmm.
things about monotheism is that it poses the problem of innocent suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's in some ways it seems kind of odd because like in a polytheistic world you could say like okay, there's some deities you know that you know are on your side and there's some deities that are against you, and so they're fighting it out.
Uh-huh.
But under with monotheism, that's like, well, there's this one deity, and sometimes he's on your side, and sometimes he is not. And it's like, what is up with that?
To be fair, in practice in polytheism, the gods are often pretty fickle too. Like they're
Oh,
often sometimes on your side and sometimes, I mean, in the Greek myths, they're not that consistent. But anyway, go on.
sure. But but also but monotheism also or at least sort of the major monotheistic religions, they offer a really benevolent God who you know
Well, I think the rule is in practice. I believe the real rule, yes, rhetorically everybody claims, but the real rule is, omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent. Pick two, right? That's
yeah yeah
like intellectual honesty demands you pick two of those
yeah
if you've looked outside your window.
yeah. So that's the thing. That's the thing because like not everyone is as intellectually honest, you know, as to assert the position that you assert. You know, a lot of people try and try and
Yeah.
argue for all three, and
Hmm.
some people manage to wrap their head around it, but
Hmm.
I have a lot of trouble with that, and there are plenty of people who say like, if you ask them like, why was my baby born with cystic fibrosis, they will say,
Hmm.
I don't know, but God has a plan. It's for the best. It's ultimately we don't know what his plan is, but you know, but he has a plan, and that's a tough one. That I think that is that's a very tough pill to swallow,
Uh-huh.
and so I mean that's what that story is about.
Yeah. When I say it's angry, I'm not. It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't read to me. And this is uh, now I'm talking as a reader and maybe I don't know critic or something. I'm not. I don't know your brain, so I'm. This is an imaginary Ted Chiang that I'm talking about. But it's necessarily when you read a story that says Ted Chiang on the front, you're in dialogue with the imaginary author in your head. But like it doesn't read to me like, sure, it doesn't read to me like you have the kind of chip on your shoulder beef that like some ex-religious people have where they are like, you know now they see the light and they resent all the lies they were told. That's not what it reads like. But it actually reads like you're like, well, you're religious. It actually reads like someone who was sheltered from the fact of the existence of religion and had a sort of security in knowing that the world followed predictable rules and assumed that everyone thought that way, and then like to their horror encountered people who thought this other way, and that there's a moment of like, what the fuck, like that's what I get from that story. Now, you know what I mean, not like, maybe anger is the wrong word, but there's a kind of a horrified, it's like you want to sort of shove under the noses of some people the the contradiction or the moral horror that their rhetoric leads to. And I don't know, I mean, when I say as a reader and critic, like it's sort of like, I mean, as I said, I'm interested in looking at my own work through the lens of like Start the Clock as a house hunting story. Start the Clock is a story in which I wrote that story right after like I came home from Europe and I had some friends and we really wanted to live together. We looked for a bunch of different apartments, but they just wanted a bigger place and we wanted a place that was that. And it was just it turned out our adult incompatibility. And this was people I grew up with, you know, friend of mine who I grew up with, we really wanted to live just next door to each other, have our kids play, but it didn't work out because our adult selves had these and partners and whatever had these incompatible needs for the dream of our child selves. Like that's what's behind Start the Clock, right? So like I'm interested. Like it's not like it's a scene from my life. I wasn't arrested at in development at 12 by a virus, but like or a 9. But that's the echo. I'm interested in that, and also like it's like eras. Like you are my age. We are Cold War babies, right? We like grew up in the end of the Cold War and the Reagan era. And this feels like a story written by a person who was, to some extent, sheltered from the existence of this kind of thinking and then lived through the rise of like the politicization of American evangelical Christianity becoming a what seemed in the 80s like this sudden overwhelming political force, you know, and not seemed, I mean, it turned out to be like pretty powerful, but you know what I'm saying? Like that's I get 80s Cold War rise of Jerry Falwell vibes. That's my excursion into autobiography.
Hmm. I don't know if they're certainly not conscious on my part, but but it could be that I was maybe influenced by maybe other treatments of religion from people of maybe close to our generation. Not sure.
Like
Um,
what? Like what are you thinking of? Because I can't think of very many stories that are like hell as the absence of God, honestly.
well, so there's this movie called The Rapture uh,
Mm.
by Michael Tolkien, who
Hmm.
also maybe better known for writing The Player.
Okay.
So The Rapture it's about this woman who you'd say, I guess, as the movie begins, I guess you'd say she's living a life of sin, and then she is
Uh-huh.
born again. She finds religion, but over time, her faith is tested.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's tested uh, in ways that, yeah, that I guess push her to her limits. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, I mean, I'd recommend it. If you,
Okay. But is it a take? Are you reacting to the Rapture, or is it like? Do you feel like it's in a similar vein? Do you feel like he's playing the same game that you are in a way of saying, what if we take this? Is the idea that he's doing kind of the same thing that you are as saying, if we take this to its logical conclusion, or
yeah, I think he is. I think he is. He is sort of asking like, how much are you willing to give? How much
hmm
are you willing to give, no matter how much God asks of you?
hmm
I don't know. I guess I don't know. Is that is because like that's in some ways that's the story of Job. That's I mean the book of Job.
yeah. Right, but Job ends up complaining a lot. And the answer that Job is given is not, oh, don't worry, I have a plan. It's all for the best. The answer that Job is given is, where were you when I made the sun?
Yeah, which is not
Who
an
are you
answer at
to
all.
ask?
Yeah, that's not an answer at all. Uh,
Um, in a way it
it's
is. In a way it is an answer. I mean, I think it's a pretty clear answer. It's like, I think that, well, I mean, of course, these are texts which by their nature, like one of the reasons these texts have been so successful at propagating themselves is the incredible wealth of variant meanings that you can come up with. They are actually very beautifully crafted to be polyvalent. So it's not like what I say is the answer. But Well, I read that as like omniscient, omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and pick two. Who said? I think that is saying to Job, why do you expect that the universe will be arranged so that you will prosper? Who says? Like, what if you know what I mean? Like, in Omphalos, she finds out that they're not at the center of the universe. I think that's what Job is saying. I think the point of Job is you're not the center of the universe. It's not a non-answer. It's like you should expect the universe to not be taking care of you. That's what I think where were you when I put the sun in the sky means. You're one of like a whole bunch of organisms. A bunch of foxes died. You worry about those? In fact, anyway, go on.
Well, so part of maybe my issue with the Book of Job is that it has this happy ending tacked on at the end.
Right. Yes. Well, all of a sudden he gets everything back, and yes, I totally agree. That's what I mean about it being polyvalent. You can also read Job like, oh, he was faithful and he was rewarded at the end for his faith, and I think that probably has been a popular reading throughout time. Possibly even the reason they tacked that on at the end is somebody was unhappy with the middle, because of course these are also not single author texts. So there's a lot going on.
Yeah. If the Book of Job had ended before that, then I'd probably be like, that's that is hardcore. That is I think it'd be a much less popular book if
sure. I mean, let's compare this. I'm tempted to compare this to Jonah. I mean, the end of Jonah is that Jonah is a satire on the prophets, right? Like the Book of Jonah is a satire on the prophetic tradition. It's a funny book. It's a comedy, and what happens is that Jonah is it's full of all these inversions. Jonah is a Jewish prophet, and he's told by God to go to Nineveh, which is the capital of the biggest like non-Jewish. It's like he's being told to go be a prophet in Moscow. He's like in the Cold War, and they're like, you have to go to Moscow. And he's like, what the fuck? And so he jumps on a ship and rides away, and God is like, you can't run away from God, and there makes a storm, and Jonah takes a nap during the storm that's about to destroy the boat. The sailors wake him up, and he's like, well, he reluctantly admits that they have to throw him overboard because he's the reason. And they're like, we don't want to throw you overboard. And then there's this long dialogue where he's trying to convince him to throw him overboard. And anyway, he throws him overboard. He gets swallowed by a whale. This is a punchline. He gets swallowed by a whale. He's 3 days in the belly of a whale, and he's really pissed off. And then in the whale, he begins to repent. He feels bad. He's like, fine, I'll go to Nineveh. Whale spits him out on Nineveh. He walks for 3 days. It's a giant city. Everything's very tall tale, like how long that he has to wait. And you have to realize in the prophetic traditions, they're always about this prophet who's the man from the desert, who sees God, who's not full of your doesn't believe in your hierarchies. Everyone worships the king, everyone obeys the king, but not this dirty old man from the desert. He comes in dirty in the sense of he doesn't take a bath, not that he's sexually lascivious. He's this righteous guy. It's the prophetic stories are satisfying for the people living under the thumb of the king, because some guy who just listens to God and is like, fuck the king, and calls the king on his shit. And the king always like refuses and doesn't, and then God sends, bad things happen, and the king is stiff-necked and won't. The prophet is on the side of God, and the king is the bad guy, right? That's the standard narrative for these heroic prophet stories. So in Jonah, the prophet is like, does not want to do this. He goes to the king of Nineveh, the non-Jewish big enemy republic, or not republic, kingdom, and he's like, okay, God says you got to repent. And the king is like, oh my God, we will totally repent. Everybody fasts. Not only they fast, not only they put on sackcloth and ashes, the cows put on sackcloth and ashes. The cows wear burlap and repent. All the goats, everybody, they super repent, and God's like, okay, cool, I won't blow them up. And then Jonah is pissed off because God didn't blow up the city. He's pissed off, and he goes outside, and he goes and sits in the desert, and he's like, I'm going to die, because now I look really foolish, because I told them that God was going to destroy the city. Now they repented, everything's fine, God forgave them, fuck that. So he goes in the desert, and he wants to die. And then he's sitting in the desert, he's feeling very sorry for himself. And God causes this plant to grow, which gives him shade and has a gourd, and it's great. It's like now he's in the shade, there's a gourd, he can drink water from the gourd, he's in great shape. He's like, this is great, he's feeling a little better. Then the next day, the sun comes up, the plant dies. Now Jonah's really pissed off. He's like, I want to die again, because fuck you. Why did you give me this plant? and then take it away. You suck. And God is like, did you try taking care of the plant? And he's like, why did you forgive Nineveh? And he's like, there's a lot of people in Nineveh and also a lot of cows. That's the end of the story, by the way. The book of Jonah ends with God saying, and a lot of cows, which I think is hilarious. Anyway, so I think it's fair to say the book of Jonah is like, maybe it's I mean, first of all, it's just satirizing and sending up a lot of things. It also has a very universalistic message because it's making fun of the nationalistic fervor of a lot of the prophetic texts, which are like, purge, get the bad gods away, only worship the one God, Judea for the Jews or whatever. The book of Jonah is much more making fun of all that, and it's very ecumenical in its sentiments, but also it's kind of like, maybe it's not God's job to take care of the plant. Like, I mean, in a way, it's like, is God benevolent in Job? I mean, God is benevolent. He forgives Nineveh, but like, that's almost like a literary device. I don't know. I'm just saying, I think I think Jonah and Job are interesting read in combination. And certainly you could read Job, like, if you repent, God will take care of you. And I guess you could read Jonah that way, but Jonah's sort of making fun of that. Anyway, where am I ending up on this? There's a lot of ways to read these texts.
Yes.
I guess I just wanted to tell the story of Jonah.
But well, yeah. If you're looking for a movie to watch, check out The Rapture.
The Rapture. Okay, so that's all right. What else do I have? Oh, here's my question about Omphalos. And I think this Omphalos is a much gentler story. Hell is the absence of God. I don't know if it's anger or revulsion, but it's a horrific. It's a very intentionally, like, we will root out every logic, this namby-pamby idea that all is for the best. We are going to shove your nose in the intellectual dishonesty of that. That's what I mean by being an angry story. Omphalos, much gentler story. Dorothea, her theology. Here's the thing. She is a scientist who thinks there's only one miracle that's sort of verified and understood. Like, she's like, basically like, there was this one miracle. That's what we can trace everything from. She's also like, I was rude to this person because I was full of myself, and then this other person said this thing, and then I realized it was wrong. Thank you, God, for gently showing me the error of my ways. So there's do you know what I mean? Like, does God intervene in Dorothea's world? Does she believe in an interventionist God? Or in fact, is she also says, I don't pray because I never prayed because I thought it would make you do things. I only ever prayed because I thought it would make me do things. Is she, one of the reasons I think it's a gentler story is I think that arguably that tension between the one verifiable miracle, which Dorothea believes because of scientific evidence, and the notion that she also appreciates that God sent her this person to show her the error of her ways, maybe renders the notion of divine intervention a more fluid and ambivalent kind of space than like, pick one, God's in charge or not. Blind watchmaker or special providence in the fall of a sparrow, decide.
Well, so obviously, there are all sorts of Christians. There are devout Christians who are also astronomers, and and so they have found a way to reconcile these things in a way which seems a little odd to me, but like I can wrap my head around it. It's much easier for me to wrap my head around that than the cystic fibrosis is for the best. That's much harder for me.
But in some ways, you're just picking two examples that exist on the same continuum. On some level, like the idea that Dorothea, like one example is horrific. The other example is like, I mean, a child got cystic fibrosis. A person told Dorothea a story in a way that made her realize she was acting prideful. Those are both events that happened in the world. One is people are a monotheist is, in your view, like by Dorothea is clear nothing if not intellectually honest, and clearly believes in a benevolent God. Like, how is it different? Her thinking that the person was sent to her to give her an update on her pridefulness versus thinking that God gave a kid cystic fibrosis.
No, she doesn't. She does not believe in an interventionist God because, like as she says, there's only one verifiable miracle. So when she thanks God for sort of a reminder to not be prideful, that is just an indication of her general approach, how religion informs her general approach to her general outlook to life, on life, which is one of gratitude, which
Mm-hmm. She's saying, I believe what you're saying is she's saying, or try this on, is she in fact saying, thank you, God, for in your one active miracle of creation, designing a world which would develop in such a way that this person would at Tuesday on 10 o'clock in the morning, show me the errors of my ways.
I would say
Maybe not
that.
intentionally, but creating a world in which such things happen.
Her attitude is one of her attitude about God is not that everything that happens in her daily life is a deliberate and a designed part of God's plan,
Mm-hmm.
but that her faith in God gives her an appreciation of life and it primes her to look for opportunities to be thankful to him,
Mm-hmm.
which I think of as different than claiming that everything is part of his plan.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to hear you say it. I mean, because actually, of course, I operate the same way as Dorothea. So, fair enough. So we should wrap up because that was like an hour longer than we said. At the end of a podcast like this, it is traditional to say, like, where should people find you? But are you even findable? Do you wish to be found? I was tickled to read the New Yorker profile of you, which took all of the, TED quirks that I know and love and sort of fashioned them into a mythic narrative of your almost like gnomic isolation where you were, pondering all day in a cold. It seemed like you were pondering all day in a cold monastic cell and at the end of it writing one line in a quill pen, which immediately like glowed. And do you know what I mean? It was like one would be led to believe that you certainly had no website and did not want to be found and would only appear at certain times and places to produce glory. But But Ted, where can people find you?
Maybe I'll just say don't look for me. I'll find you.
You never know when Ted might be coming around the corner. It was great to talk to you.
I had a good time too.